Hi, my name is Chaim. This is my friend Saul.
أهلا وسهلا بك في صديقي.
Show him your page. Show him the page. Yeah, you see those? Yeah, those funny little looking things there. Yeah, no, they're cool. I like them. Anyways, this video is a discussion between Saul and I um, about the difference between Orthodox and the other movements of Judaism. Is there a difference? And if there is a difference, what are those differences, and who is right and who is wrong, or can we say anyone is right or wrong? This is the discussion at hand. So, Saul, being that you are the guest, why don't you start off with the discussion?
So, Orthodox is the only real Judaism. Conservatism. Okay, this conservatism is good. Right here, Republican Party. The elephant. Big
Now,
elephant.
granted, we just want to make a stance before we go any further. He is coming from a purely fundamentalist stance,
I'm one of God's warriors.
and
Like Christian Amanpour says.
I am coming from more of a neutral stance. So, the once we go further into the discussion, you will you obviously will see this. So go ahead.
So, the only real Judaism that has existed ever since the time of the Torah was given was, is, and has always and will be Orthodox Judaism, which believes in the oral law, or the written law, and the Holy Zohar.
The Holy Zohar. So,
However, every other movement, first of all, reform that started up in Germany, that wanted to become more like the Goyim, more like the Gentiles, lost their way in trying to become more like the Gentiles. They're a heretical movement, and I'll tell you why. Because when they first started out, they totally did away with all the commandments, which is forbidden to do in the Torah. And they also allowed people to play instruments on the Shabbat, and they moved the Shabbat, they changed it to Sunday instead of Saturday, because they wanted to be more like the Gentiles. That right there is heretical. You're not allowed to change one word from the Torah. Every time you change a word from the Torah, you are going against God, you're going against Torah.
so I have a question for you.
Hold on.
One quick question. Are they right or are they wrong?
They're wrong! Azur! Kovrim!
Okay, you see how when it goes up to red it means that it's really loud.
Sorry.
It's okay, it's cool. But why are they wrong? Tell me, why do you think they are wrong?
Okay, so I was going to go into conservative and also reconstructionist. But so I was going to go into all of them first, and then we'll discuss why they're...
Okay, but granted, let's just so we can keep the attention span of the listeners.
Sure.
Let's try to let's keep it conservative.
So we're going to stick this with the Reform Jews and why they're wrong.
Okay, why are they wrong?
They are wrong because they've changed the Torah. All right? It's against... Anytime you change the Torah one letter and one iota, you are no longer doing what God wants you to do. God sends you a perfect book from the heavens. All right? We received it with our hands open like this. All right? Hashem dropped it in our hands. All right? God dropped it in our hands. And when somebody goes out and they say, hey, yeah, God, this is really nice, but I really don't like this kind of thing, so I'm going to like go there and change it.
I'm going to interject something. Was it the people who you're talking about, like the reformists in from Germany and also America, were they the ones that God dropped the Torah in their hands to, or was it their ancestors?
It was their ancestors.
So the question is, how do we know that Orthodox Judaism is right and Reformism is wrong?
We know that Orthodox Judaism is right and conservatism is wrong. It's because we follow the real Torah, and we follow what the Torah says by the letter of the word, and nobody else does that in the world.
But the question is how do we know that? How do we know that God gave it to us? The question. Let me rephrase the question. It's not that I'm not trying to ask whether theirs is the original form of Judaism or not. My question is whether we know that what they're doing is wrong, whether it is against Torah or not, whether they're allowed to allowed to eat pork, allowed to work on Shabbos or do things that are considered breaking the Shabbos, how do we know that they're going against God? Like,
We know they're going against God because God gave us a book.
but how do we
That
know
are the
God gave
do's
us
and
a book?
don'ts.
That's the real question.
How do we know God gave us the book?
Yeah.
So where do you want me to start? You want to talk about the archaeological evidence that exists? Do you want to talk about the logical standpoint of how we got the Torah? Do you want to talk about how the Torah has been unchanged for ever since it's been made? 3,000 years, there's never been one change to the Torah, as opposed to every other religious book that has always been continually changed. Every Quran and New Testament has like thousands of other versions. There's only one version of Torah.
But many would say, and there's a lot more than from what you're saying, would say that there's actually more archaeological data that would disprove the Torah.
No, that's not true at all.
Why is that?
All right, so they have found coins,
Mhm.
all right, that dates back to the Beit HaMikdash. They have found evidence in Masada that proves the oral law, all right, because, for example, the Gemara talks about how to use a fragrance on Shabbat and how to put perfume on, and that there's a way to do it by putting like a little paper in a bottle, and you fill up with perfume.
But how does
And
this prove that God gave us the Torah?
it proves that God gave us the Torah. And first of all, what we do now, people were doing in the past as well. Nothing has changed.
But
If God gave us something that is pure, that is completely connected, it would never change.
okay, well, for instance, the what about 1 + 1 = 2? That will never change, also. So, if but then again, that's proof that if you have an apple and you pair it with another apple, that's two. But at the same time, though, Torah has changed to many Jews. Maybe for the Orthodox it stayed the same, but for other Jews it's it's changed. And I don't think that the idea of something not changing is proof that God gave it to us. Um, I mean, I think that the only way to actually prove it is to actually see God doing it. Otherwise, if that was the case, everyone would know that God exists, not believe or disbelieve. They would know.
Look, it will always have a little Yetzer in the back, a little Satan, that you can have all the proof in the world and you can still be in your ear. You can no matter how much evidence you have to prove anything, you can always have in the back of the mind the big doubt that like, oh wait, this is not true. No matter how much
But
evidence,
what is that doubt called?
huh?
What is that doubt called?
It's called the Yetzer Hara,
Or to put it into English,
the
reasoning.
evil inclination.
Also, AKA known as reason, AKA reasoning.
It's the evil inclination. Nothing wrong with reasoning. There's a time and a place for it. But
So you're saying that to question whether God exists or not and has a will for us or not is not a good enough, is not good to ask. It's not the right time and place to ask it, especially like.
that's like it's like a heretical question. I mean, if this is like a kid that is like, just starting out in Judaism and wants to know more about it, and he wants proof for God, and he's like totally lost, then I totally understand that. If this is a guy that's like still unsure and just keeps going in circles and circles, that's.
But what if it's someone from like who grew up in a secular society, who someone tells so a religious Jew comes up to him and says, "Hey, God exists," and then he says, "Can you prove to me that God exists?" What would be that proof?
Will be that proof? Well, the one thing is that the Torah is the only book that has never changed in history.
But you see, but you're going in circles. I'm not asking you whether the Torah changed or not.
Uh-huh.
I'm asking whether God exists or not.
So there's many proofs for that. You can look at archaeological evidence that under the Red Sea that shows chariots that from Egypt that dates back to the Exodus. You have the ring of Joseph, who was the viceroy of Egypt. In Joseph, and it say Joseph the Hebrew on the inscription.
But you're still not answering the
I
question.
am answering the question.
You're talking about people, though. I'm talking about the proof for God, whether He gave us the Torah or not. We're talking about how do we know that God exists. Once we can answer that question, then all the other questions can be uniform.
We know God exists because
answered uniformly.
The historical record of the Torah can be verified.
But that doesn't prove that God exists. That's saying us that because let me bring in an example. Someone could have written a book and made sure he had a method for it to be perfectly preserved throughout the generations. And let's say this book has been unchanged, and now almost 4,000 years later, this book is still here, intact. Okay, that doesn't change the fact that us today have never met that author. It just goes to show that this book hasn't changed. That's not the question. The question is, how do we know that God exists?
How do we know God?
For all we know, some guy could have wrote the Torah.
That's impossible.
Why is it impossible?
There's no man that could write the Torah.
Why is that?
Why?
Yeah.
Because then there would be thousands of mistakes in the Torah.
How do you know that?
Well, you know that because you know that every single Torah is the same everywhere in the world.
But I'm saying, how does that prove God exists?
It proves God exists because it proves that no man made the Torah. Every time a man makes something or writes something, it's like telephone. You ever play telephone?
Yeah, you play telephone, but there are times when it actually does come around perfectly to the end of the circle.
That is very, very rare. That rarely happens.
It's not rare.
Give me one example.
It's a 50-50.
Give me one example of something that's been passed orally and been written several times, and that's been perfect. Because this is news to me.
It's not news. I mean, obviously you have books that go back a long way, such as like the books from the Hindu religion.
Those have been altered a lot.
Altered a lot. Okay. Well, we would have to research that. And then, what about the regular, just fictional books such as like the Odyssey? That even though they're based on realistic events, nevertheless we know that they're fiction. Has that book been changed?
I'm pretty sure there are several versions of the Odyssey.
Okay, point taken there. But what about I don't know if this will. I don't know how long.
We'll see how long it keeps going. Just keep talking.
Okay. What about let's just take a book from like maybe, let's say like a something like from like 300 years ago, the Constitution.
They had the printing press.
Constitution.
They had the printing press back then.
Yeah.
You can't make a mistake from that.
Okay, so there you go.
But that was the printing press.
Right. So
that printing press, you could copy things thousands of times like a printer.
Right. So that right there is proof in itself that man, for the next 3,000, 4,000 years after now, could have a book that's unchanged. That doesn't prove that God exists, though.
Yes, it does.
Why
because it's only when the printing press came out. Before the printing press came out, it's nearly impossible.
How is it nearly impossible?
Because when you're writing something down for a long period of time.
Can I ask you a question? Who preserved that book perfectly, letter for letter, word for word? Who did that?
It was the Rabbanim.
It was man, right? There you go. That's that right there tells you. You're telling me that the proof of God is that this book is perfectly preserved, right? And you're saying, and to prove that point, that no other book can do that because this is written by God. But you just answered it for me. You just said that it was man who perfectly preserved this book. If man was so imperfect before the printing press, right, he would have made a mistake.
But there's a very, very big difference.
What's the difference?
All right, we had prophets. We had the oral law that tells us how to write a Sefer Torah.
But once the prophets stopped being, we had the end of that era of prophets, how did we still perfectly preserve
We
it.
had the oral law.
Okay, but we still had to preserve it, the oral
The
law.
oral law was given word of mouth, back and forth,
Right, but
which was only allowed.
but you remember it was almost forgotten to the point where they had to write it down.
Yeah, eventually, yeah.
But even then, it's like they were having trouble trying to remember all the written law. When they're like, we're even starting to forget it. We have to start writing it down because even us were starting to forget it, and they started writing it down. That shows even more the fallible side to man, and that even the Torah is susceptible to change.
But the Torah never changed.
How do we know that?
It was just put down in paper, but Torah's never changed. You see it through archaeological evidence. You see it in Masada. You see it in the first and second temple periods. They've found mikvot. You might want to think what mikvot are. Mikvah is.
It's a purification process through immersing yourself, submersing yourself in water,
You
your whole
basically
body
get
in water,
naked in front of a bunch of guys,
in order
and then you just like go under the water 3 times.
to basically like pull away the impurity from you. The water basically encompasses you and is supposed to hold all the sins after you leave.
So, anyways, there is a halachic requirement of how big the mikveh has to be and how much water it has to have inside. All right, they have gone back to the temple periods and they have found the exact measurements. All right, exact measurements of these mikvahs and how big they were according to the oral Torah. Which, by the way, was a long time before it was written down. The oral Torah was written down. The first part, which is the Mishneh, was written down, all right, in about 200 CE. No, 200 AD, I think. No, 200 BCE.
From this discussion that we've had, and I don't know how much longer we can do it before we lose people's attention span, but from what I gather at least, you have expressed the fact that that human has perfectly preserved a set of laws, a book, an idea, a concept, but that there is no way to prove the existence of God.
You can definitely prove it.
But in this time frame, we haven't been able to prove it.
We've been able to find a lot of archaeological evidence that supports the Torah.
But it might support the Torah, but it doesn't. It might highly suggest that the Torah might be true, but that doesn't prove the existence of God. It just suggests that Torah that there is a measurement of probability of it being true.
So if you see a pig with 3 legs, does that mean it really has 4 legs when you're seeing 3 legs?
Wait, say that again?
So you see a pig with like 3 legs, does that mean it really has 4 legs?
If you see it with 3 legs and you're observing it, it's an objective, and you're observing it objectively, and you only see 3 legs, then there's only 3 legs. I mean, you could look, and if you don't see 3 legs, that's all you see. You only see
the
3
Torah
legs.
the same way.
Why is that?
We have evidence, all right, that 300, 400, 500 years before the oral law was written down, people were doing the same thing that the oral law says. That's pretty big proof that God exists. Pretty big proof. I mean, like, I don't know what else you want. Unless you want God to, like, wave a flag. Hey, I'm God, I'm here.
Well, okay, how about this? Do we believe that George Washington exists, or do we know that he exists?
Oh, we know he existed.
Why do we know he exists?
It was only about 300 years ago.
But did you ever witness, did you ever see George Washington in your lifetime?
Yeah, I see pictures of him every day.
You see pictures of him every day, but you haven't seen him. The fact is, you don't know whether he exists. You believe based on strong evidence that highly suggests that he does exist, and therefore no one's going to argue the existence of George Washington because it's almost a moot point. And even if he didn't exist, it doesn't really change the fact that we have the United States here today, whether he did
how do you
exist
know
or
there
not.
was the United States 50 years ago?
the whole point is that we cannot prove whether George Washington existed or not,
I can go to his grave.
and dig up his bones and do some weird stuff there. I don't know. I think on that note, we have to end this video. This has been Chaim and also Saul here. And I hope you guys got something out of this 20-minute, 22-second video. Peace.